There are moments when history doesn't arrive with explosions. It arrives quietly. In the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, a single oil tanker moves forward. No weapons, no threats. And yet, above it, American surveillance aircraft circle. Nearby, a Russian submarine and naval vessels form a protective shield. This is not a war scene. This is how power collides in the 21st century. I'm Fareed Zakaria. And what you are watching is not really about oil. The ship may even be empty. This is about who enforces the rules of the world and what happens when two nuclear powers disagree without firing a shot. The United States wants to seize this tanker under sanctions law. Russia says touching it would violate international maritime law. And suddenly, a commercial vessel has become a floating line neither side wants to cross. If you care about how global conflict actually begins today, stay with me. Because to understand this standoff, we must first understand the problem the world is trying and failing to control. What exactly is the problem here? On the surface, this looks like a dispute over one ship, one tanker, one alleged violation of sanctions. But that interpretation misses the point entirely. I'm Fareed Zakaria, and this story is not about a vessel moving through international waters. It's about how the modern world tries to police bad actors without going to war and how fragile that system has become. The United States uses sanctions to stop countries like Iran and Venezuela from selling oil, not with blockades in the old sense, not with naval battles, but with paperwork, tracking systems, financial pressure, and the threat of seizure. It's power exercised indirectly. Russia is challenging that system, not by denying sanctions exist, but by exploiting the gray areas around them. Flags, registries, legal identity, military presence without aggression. This is the core tension. Sanctions depend on cooperation, but power depends on enforcement. When those two drift apart, conflict doesn't explode, it creeps. And once that happens, every routine action becomes political. To see how we arrived here, we need to look backward at the origins of this system and why it was designed this way. To understand why this confrontation feels so dangerous, we have to go back not years, but decades. After the Cold War, the world searched for a way to discipline states without repeating the catastrophes of the 20th century. Sanctions became the answer. They were supposed to be precise, legal, bloodless, a way to change behavior without firing missiles or sending armies. Oil quickly became the central lever. It is the lifeblood of states like Iran and Venezuela. Control the flow, and you control the regime's ability to survive. Over time, sanctions evolved into a complex global system built on shipping registries, insurance markets, tracking data, and compliance networks. But every system creates incentives to evade it. As sanctions tightened, a shadow fleet emerged. Tankers changed names. Flags were swapped mid-voyage. Ownership was buried under layers of shell companies. What looked like maritime commerce became a game of legal camouflage. Russia watched all of this carefully. It learned that sanctions are only as strong as the willingness of others to enforce them. And enforcement, unlike law, requires power, ships, aircraft, presence. That is the historical fault line we are now standing on. And once history sets a trap like this, it rarely springs just once. Then came the first rupture. Last month, the United States tried to board this tanker in the Caribbean. It had a warrant. It believed the ship was carrying sanctioned oil. And under its interpretation of the rules, it was acting legally. But before American forces could step aboard, the tanker did something extraordinary. It changed course, abruptly, dramatically. It headed not toward Venezuela, but toward Europe. That single maneuver changed everything. Suddenly, this was no longer a quiet enforcement action in familiar waters. It was a moving confrontation across the Atlantic. U.S. military aircraft began appearing overhead, refueling tankers, reconnaissance planes, helicopters. Not an attack, but a message. Russia responded in kind. A submarine, naval escorts, and a declaration that this ship, now flying a Russian flag, was under its protection and sailing peacefully in international waters. This was the moment the story stopped being about sanctions and became about precedent. Because if the United States boarded the ship, it would test the limits of maritime law. If it didn't, it would expose the limits of its power. And when great powers are forced to choose between law and credibility, the consequences ripple far beyond one vessel. If this escalation feels unsettling, pay attention, because the real danger lies beneath the surface. What makes this confrontation so unsettling is not what we can see, but what's hidden underneath. This is a conflict built on systems most people never notice. Shipping registries, insurance rules, identification numbers, sanctions lists. On paper, they look technical, neutral, apolitical. In reality, they are instruments of power. The United States does not enforce sanctions by chasing flags or painted names. It targets identity, the vessel's history, its ownership networks, its sanctions record. That's why changing a ship's name or even its flag often changes very little. But reflagging to Russia changes something fundamental. Under international maritime law, a ship flying a state's flag is protected by that state. Boarding it without consent risks escalation. Not legally first, but politically. And Russia knows this. By sending naval escorts, Moscow isn't preparing for a fight. It's raising the cost of enforcement, turning a legal action into a strategic decision, forcing Washington to ask a question it hates. Is this ship worth the risk? This is how modern power works. Not through force, but through complication. Every rule becomes leverage. Every ambiguity becomes a shield. And when systems designed to prevent conflict begin to create it instead, pressure doesn't release. It builds. The next shock doesn't come from law or paperwork. It comes from people. Then came the second surge of tension, and it moved faster. As the tanker advanced through the North Atlantic, the signals multiplied. U.S. military aircraft increased their presence. Transport planes, surveillance platforms, assets designed not to strike, but to watch, to track, to be ready. This was pressure without ignition. At the same time, American officials made something clear. They preferred to seize the ship, not sink it. That sentence matters, because it reveals intent and restraint operating side by side. Russia, meanwhile, spoke the language of law. It described the attention on the vessel as clearly disproportionate. It emphasized peaceful passage, international waters, legal compliance. Every word was chosen to narrow Washington's options. This is the second crisis point. Not a single dramatic act, but a narrowing corridor of choice. If the United States acts, it risks confrontation with a nuclear power. If it hesitates, it signals that military protection can neutralize sanctions. Either path reshapes behavior far beyond this voyage. In moments like this, escalation doesn't come from aggression. It comes from momentum. And once momentum takes over, individuals are no longer in control. Ordinary people are. And this is where the story stops being abstract. Because when systems collide, it's not governments that absorb the shock. It's you. You feel it when fuel prices rise without warning, when inflation eats into salaries, when supply chains tighten and no one can quite explain why. These confrontations, quiet, legal, distant, translate into real pressure on everyday life. Sanctions are designed to target states, but their side effects travel outward. They touch shipping costs, insurance rates, energy markets, and when enforcement becomes uncertain, volatility fills the gap. You don't see the tanker, you don't track the aircraft overhead, but you live with the consequences of the decisions made around them. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The more sanctions rely on force to be credible, the more ordinary people become exposed to geopolitical risk they never chose. This is why these moments matter. Not because they make headlines, but because they shape the invisible architecture of your economic life. If you want to understand the forces quietly rewriting the rules that govern your future, stay with me. Because this isn't just about one country or one ship, it's about how the world reacts next. What happens next doesn't stop at the Atlantic. Because once great powers test each other in one domain, the signal travels fast, allies watch closely, rivals take notes, neutral actors recalculate risk. If sanctions can be challenged by naval protection, other states will adapt. Tankers will sail with escorts. Registries will become political tools. Commercial shipping routes will quietly militarize, not through battleships, but through presence. This is how local enforcement becomes global friction. Europe is pulled in first. These waters are near its trade arteries. Any escalation forces coordination. Any misstep demands response. Even silence becomes a position. Beyond that, the precedent spreads. Iran, Venezuela. Other sanctioned actors see possibility. Not defiance, but protection. Not open confrontation, but insulation. The world doesn't fracture all at once. It fragments, one exception at a time, one rule bent, one norm stretched. And when global systems lose predictability, power fills the vacuum. Not law, not consensus. Power. This is the quiet danger of this standoff. Not what happens if a ship is boarded, but what happens if it isn't. Because the rules that hold the world together rarely collapse in dramatic moments. They erode, and erosion, once it begins, is very hard to stop. So where does this lead? There are three paths forward, and none of them are clean. The first is restraint. The United States chooses not to board the ship. Russia completes the escort. The immediate crisis fades. But the signal is clear. Military protection can shield sanctioned vessels. Sanctions still exist, but their edge is dulled. Enforcement becomes selective. Credibility weakens. The second path is managed confrontation. Washington finds a way to act without triggering escalation. Legal pressure, financial seizure downstream, quiet coordination with allies. The system survives, but only through complexity. Sanctions become harder to apply, slower to work, and more dependent on consensus that is already fraying. The third path is escalation, a boarding attempt, a miscalculation, a moment where law meets force too directly. No one wants this outcome. But systems under stress don't always produce rational results. Here's the deeper truth. This isn't about choosing the best option. It's about managing decline. The decline of a sanctions regime built for a world with fewer great powers willing to push back. The future won't be decided by one tanker. It will be decided by how often moments like this repeat and what the world learns from them. And that brings us to the final question. What should we take away from all of this? The lesson here is not about Russia or the United States or even this tanker. It's about the world we are sliding into quietly. For decades, global order was enforced through systems that worked because most players accepted them. Sanctions mattered because power backed them and because no one seriously challenged that balance. That era is fading. What we are seeing now is not chaos. It is something more subtle. A world where rules still exist, but enforcement is negotiated in real time. Where law competes with power. Where gray zones replace red lines. This tanker may reach port, or it may be seized. Either way, the precedent is already set. The question for you is not who wins this standoff. It's whether the systems you rely on, trade, energy, stability, can survive repeated tests like this, because the next confrontation won't look identical. But it will follow the same pattern. If you want to understand how global power is actually shifting and what it means for your future, this conversation doesn't end here. Stay with me. Share this. And join me for the next chapter, where we examine what replaces order when enforcement becomes optional. Because history rarely announces itself, but it always leaves clues.